While the United States is still Japan's core provider of international security, the nature of the partnership has changed as a result of new demands from the United States, but also due to renewed threats such as the new North Korean missile crisis and the rise of China. The Japanese government is also confronted with many non-traditional security threats, such as international terrorism, the spread of infectious diseases, global environmental threats, and a much more volatile economic environment today. At the domestic level, administrative and socioeconomic reforms, demographic change, and the consequences of economic globalization for Japanese competitiveness at the end, and the domestic labor market, as well as growing government debt, raised questions about the sustainability of the current Japanese lifestyle and led to a heightened sense of insecurity among many Japanese. After a long post-war period of relative prosperity and social and economic stability, Japan, or Japanese society and politics today has to deal with many of these issues all at the same time, and Japanese themselves feel far less secure than they felt until the end of the 1980s, and especially so, I think, over the last 10 years. This increased threat perception led to demands from the public to the Japanese government to deal with these issues and these constantly changing situations. Governing insecurity, this book goes beyond traditional concepts of security, which is often limited to national security, and is dealing with government efforts to organize security against various degrees of material threats. Instead, insecurity used in this book is used in a much more broader context and specifically includes the perception of security and insecurity. The main issues discussed in this volume deal with Japan's growing perception of regional and global insecurity, the changing role of military forces, perceived risk of Chinese foreign investment, societal, cultural, and labor insecurity, and how it is affected by demographic change and migration, as well as food insecurity and its challenges on health and public policy. In recent years, there has been increased interest in these issues, dealing with traditional as well as non-traditional security issues, changes in traditional security threats perceived, and the effect of the domestic discourse between major political actors, with a focus on changes in the 1990s and 2000s. We can observe gradual changes in Japanese willingness to use military forces, as demonstrated by the 1992 PKO law, and is giving rear area support to Allied forces in the war against Iraq or Afghanistan, and refueling mission in the Indian Ocean. Therefore, in the last couple of years, many have begun to question whether Japan is militarizing or whether Japan is simply adapting its international role from a peace state to an international state. As a country in East Asia with strong security ties with the United States, Japan's activity in the Asian region was limited to issues of economic cooperation, development development assistance, and trade. Shifts in U.S. attention, growing concerns about abandonment, and most of all the rising China forced Japan to become a more active player in the region, and an attempt to protect Japan's exceptionally political and economic position. There's another aspect of security, and that is how less predictable global and regional environment is under globalization with all its dimensions, and how it has affected the Japanese perceived insecurity and affected the way Japanese perceive their own country. While government and corporate responses to perceived and actual threats to Japanese political and economic well-being have attracted a lot of attention in recent years, others have focused on the effects of the globalizing world on Japanese society and Japanese people. For example, the slow but persistent increase of foreigners and migrants into Japan, a country with a comparatively small number of foreign citizens, but we will hear a bit more about that a bit later. And the question what influence this will have on social cohesion, threat perception, cultural values, national identity, and labor relations, and how Japanese society and its government reacts to this development. Problems caused by migration and possibly a forming of a multicultural society in Japan has received a lot of attention in recent years. This book tries to combine the influence of traditional and new security threats on the domestic discourse in Japan. The core question of all the chapters in this book, and just go, this is the table of contents of the book. The core question of all the chapters is how the Japanese public perceives these insecurities and how these perceptions influence the public discourse, who the main stakeholders of this discourse are, their positions, and how this affects state-society relations in Japan and the policy decisions of the Japanese government. Concepts used, among others, is the so-called securitization theory. So the question to what degree certain problems that I have just mentioned are securitized, so to what degree they are brought into the scope of, to what degree they affect Japanese lifestyles, and to what degree they might at least theoretically undermine or threaten Japanese lifestyles and the continuation of the life in Japan. The book basically has two parts, and the first part basically talks about individual and societal aspects of insecurity, and the second one about international and economic aspects of insecurity. I'm not going to introduce all the chapters of this book here, but I'm happy to reflect on a few chapters that I don't have time at this point to talk about, but I'm really happy that we have 4 contributors to this book who are going to talk about these aspects, or some aspects of the questions that I just mentioned here today. The first on my right here is Paul Midford, who is at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology and is an expert on Japanese security and foreign policy, and has published a number of books and articles on this issue, particularly recently on public perception or public opinion on foreign and security issues, and he's going to talk about his chapter in a moment. Next to him is David Chiavaci from the University of Zurich in Switzerland, who has a long record of writing about migration, especially labor migration into Japan, and what this means not only for the Japanese labor markets, but also to a certain feeling probably of insecurity of the Japanese themselves. And then on the very left from your side is Reinhard Drifte, an emeritus professor of Newcastle University, basically also someone who doesn't really need any introduction, who has published quite extensively also on Japanese foreign and security policy, specifically Japan-China relations, and he is looking into the increased investment of Chinese companies in Japan in particular. Because we have limited time today, I would like to start, and we go in this order, and tell you a little bit about the first chapter here, and I will keep my remarks very, very briefly. The title of my chapter is Increasing Threat Perceptions and Anti-Militarist Norms in Japan. The question of this chapter, basically, the basic question that many have begun to ask since the 1990s, but I guess specifically in the last couple of years, is how long will this this very strong anti-militarist sentiment that has become the core of Japanese identity since the 1947 so-called Peace Constitution and Article 9, of course, in particular, how long is this going to last? will the rise of China, the threat that comes from North Korea, and a couple of other issues force Japan and force the Japanese public to accept a more active role of especially of the self-defense forces of Japan. And of course, over the last couple of weeks, everyone who's following Japanese politics and Japanese foreign politics, the core issue, of course, last couple of weeks was collective defense. And everyone is wondering about the question, is Abe able to convince Komeito, his small coalition partner, to accept a more active or activist role of the Japanese self-defense forces to participate in collective defense activities, or especially collective security activities with the Americans or potentially with other countries. And so this is basically the core question that I try to ask here. And my first assumption here was that if Japanese are more worried, that if their threat levels are higher, they're concerned about China, they're concerned about North Korea, they're concerned about a number of other issues, globalization, their market, other countries trying to take over their markets, whether it's Chinese investment and so on and so forth. So I looked at first, for example, the question of threat perception. This is a study that is done on a regular basis by the Japanese government, and they asked this question: how likely do you think that Japan will be involved in a war? I guess if you generally would ask this question, one would probably say it's very unlikely that Japan is actually involved in a war. But as you can see, this development over the last 40 years, basically, a large percentage, usually more than 50% of the Japanese, find it likely or very likely that Japan might be involved in a war at one point in the future. And the reason for this is basically that because of international tension and international and antagonism, that Japan might be involved in that. My specific study that I looked at is based on a public opinion poll that we did a couple of years ago in Japan and the United States. And it's unique in the sense that it asks a number of questions that are related to threat, to the perception of threat, and I will just briefly introduce a few aspects here. We looked at personal level of threat perception, and you can always see the number here of Japan and the United States, and the numbers in Japan are surprisingly high. So the first specific question I looked at here is, how likely is it for you to become a victim of a crime? And about over 50% are very concerned or somewhat concerned. And one might wonder, crime rates in Japan are very, very low. Why is that the case? The similar aspects are true on the state level. These include questions like either a war or a major economic crisis. So this is a combination of 5 or 6 questions brought together into an index. It's called additive state level of response of threat perception. You can see Japanese are significantly more worried than Americans about threats that are, or issues that are threatening to the state at large or society at large, and the same is actually true on a global level as well. So despite of the image that we have of Japan generally as a peaceful and very secure society, Japanese are very, very worried. I combined a number of issues. So this, first of all, Japanese are very, very worried. Second of all, we asked a number of other questions that I combined into a so-called militarism index. You can see the couple of questions that I asked here. War is justified when threatened by a hostile country, to attitudes towards defense spending. And I combined all of this basically into an index. And not surprisingly here, if you then divide the Japanese society into militarists, anti-militarists, and those who are in the middle, the majority of Japanese are either anti-militarists or kind of mixed, where they said, yes, maybe some increased defense spending, but we don't want to get involved in any war, and so on and so forth. Not surprisingly, also, on the other hand, the United States, the level is very, very high. So no surprise there, really. So still very strong support for anti-militarist values. And then secondly, I try to correlate the two. whether those who have more militarist values might be more inclined to support a more activist foreign policy in Japan. And because of time reasons, I have to rush through this a bit more quickly. Basically, one can see high level of personal threat perception, and then or militarists, mixed and anti-militarists. And what this is supposed to show, what this shows is basically there is no difference. There's no difference between those people who are very concerned and those people who are not very concerned as far as their support for militarist values are concerned. The same is true basically on a national level, and the same is also true on an international level. So what this shows, first of all, is that despite of the fact that Japanese should be worried about North Korea, they probably are worried about the rising China, that does not mean that Japanese are more willing to support a more activist foreign policy that includes defense spending, but a number of other issues that I just mentioned here. And Paul will talk about a very specific case in his talk in a moment. So threat does not influence how Japanese think. So when you are Abe at this point, when you're Prime Minister Abe, and you would like to convince the Japanese public that collective self-defense or collective defense is important, threatening the Japanese doesn't work, basically. This is what this shows. So to talk about the nuclear missiles or threats, that doesn't work. But there are some other issues that work to some degree. One is the Japanese thinking about migration in general. So we looked at attitudes towards migration and then correlated that with militarist, mixed, or non-militarist. And what you can see here is that anti-militarist attitudes towards immigration, one could see that anti-militarists are more likely to say immigration enriches society, and on the other hand, those who are more inclined to support the more activist foreign policy are more likely to say immigration might threaten national identity. And the second graph here at the bottom basically says something very, very similar. Talk about here immigration and threat perception. And another aspect that, this is a specific question here, immigration and defense spending. So a very specific question, are you in favor of decreasing or increasing defense spending? And those who are more suspect of migration and more concerned about migration issues are more likely to be in favor of a more activist foreign policy. And lastly, a nationalist sentiment. This is, of course, one could say, what is the national sentiment? We looked at a number of issues here, tried to how you measure more nationalist sentiment. In Japan, one question here is immigration threaten national identity, or on the other hand, immigration enriches society, and those who are more in favor of immigration threatened society are more in favor of increasing defense spending. And finally, if we combine this together, actually there was one slide which I think skipped here, which is, so nationalist sentiment and anti-immigration sentiment by and large do have some influence on the acceptance of more activist militarist attitudes, but threat does not. So threatening Japanese has very little effect on how the Japanese perceive or how willing the Japanese are to engage in a more activist foreign policy. And I think on this point, I'd like to invite Paul, who's kind of continuing basically on a very, very similar point. Okay. I may ask you.
Wow, that went from a red sun to a green sun. I don't know how that happened. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, for the kind introduction and setup there. As is always the case with my presentations, I have too many slides and too little time. I guess it's kind of the story of my life, but I'll go through this kind of quickly. I also see the formatting has changed a little bit, but that's okay. Argument has gotten a bit big. But in any case, so my basic argument, as you can see here, is that the first Abe premiership from basically September 2006 to September 2007, it gives us a pretty clear test of the proposition that Japanese public opinion has come to view external military threats as a priority that requires a strong military response. So this kind of keys off of what Wilhelm was just saying. It's in short, when we should have seen a perfect storm. We had Abe's popularity when he came into office. He was Japan's most hawkish prime minister to date. And it's also when we saw a dramatic increase in the North Korean threat. You might remember July 2006, North Korea tested several missiles in the Sea of Japan. The first time they tested missiles in a while. They tested like 3 or 4, which I believe was the largest test to that date, including at Taepodong, although that failed, 2-stage missile. But then also in October, most importantly, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test. So those things, those developments, plus an extremely hawkish prime minister, it should have been the perfect storm. We should have expected that Japanese politics became dominated by fears about external military threats, and that the election, the upper house election in 2007 would have been fought on that basis. Nonetheless, this perfect storm soon dissipated, and as the storm clouds parted, what we had instead was we had the public rejecting a security force agenda, rejecting a focus on external and military security, and instead they started focusing on domestic threats, particularly those related to Koreika Shakai, or aging society, or Kakusa Shakai, the growing economic inequality within society. So this is basically my argument. Now, this keys off of some of my other work on public opinion. And so basically what I argue here is that public attitudes, underlying attitudes, as you'll see in a moment, basically are the basis for public opinion, and that these are extremely important for having a significant impact on public policy, much more important than they're often given credit for in Japan. And elites, of course, also have a big influence on policy and also on public attitudes. And elites try to kind of mold or spin or remake public attitudes via real-world developments, what North Korea is doing, what China is doing, etc. So when we talk about security, I argue there are really 2 basic attitudes in Japan that matter. One is trust the state's control of the military, trust of civilian control, trust the state can wisely wield the sword and not drag the country into a disastrous war. And then the second is utility of military force. Does military force have any utility at all? And if so, for what? Is it unlimited utility? Can you use it as a foreign policy tool? Can you use it to suppress terrorism and WMD proliferation? Can you use it to promote democracy? Those are questions. And from these basic attitudes, we get policy opinions, which are often unmeasured, until somebody writes a survey and conducts a poll, and then you get measurable opinion. My work generally focuses on media polls in Japan, because those are the ones that have a political impact. And from that has a big impact, I argue, on policy outcomes. Of course, that's not the whole story, because obviously elites have a big influence as well. But on the other hand, measurable opinion also influences elites. In a democracy like Japan, leaders want to be re-elected. Politicians do, so they have to pay attention to the public. So basically what I argue is that even long before Abe became prime minister, during the Koizumi period, the public was prioritizing pension reform. And these are just some poll results that show that already back in November 2003 it was the second most important issue. And in 2004, polls showed that 3/4 of Japanese felt a sense of crisis regarding the falling birth rate, which is not quite the same thing as pension issue, but they're of course closely related, and many commentators in the media in Japan have drawn the connection between the two, falling birth rate leading to a crisis in the pension system. So again, the formatting is a little bit odd here, but one can look at this and the fact that Koizumi did very little about the pension issue. He did some things. And by the way, I'm of course giving a very brief summary of my chapter. My chapter has much richer polling data and discussion about Koizumi and pensions. But he essentially left Abe with a political ticking time bomb in the form of the pension issue. And at the beginning of the Abe administration, you had even more Japanese prioritizing pensions and pension reform, whereas diplomacy and security was far down on the list. But Abe ignored these priorities and focused on his personal priorities regarding constitutional reform and overseas deployment of the SDF. And then in 2007, as you probably know, we had a major pension account fiasco surfaced, a lot of lost pension records. And this was merely a trigger, I would argue, a catalyst that caused deep Japanese public concern and even anger about the pension system to surface. And more than half of Japanese indicated that even before this scandal, they had little confidence in the pension system. Again, the formatting is a bit odd here, but okay. What I want to say here is that in the upper house election, of course, the LDP lost. They lost for the first time in their history. They're no longer, as a result of this election, the largest party in the upper house. The lessons of this election were on two levels. First, the actual intention of voters, which we can look at through opinion polls, and also the lessons that politicians learned. And the lesson that politicians learned was very clear, namely, stop focusing on external security threats, stop focusing on overseas deployments of the SDF, and focus instead on domestic economic threats, such as pension reform, growing inequality in society, etc., and support for constitutional reform within the diet declined as well. This is a question from Yomiuri Shimbun that asks support for constitutional reform. Do you support changing the Constitution in general, not specifically Article 9? And you can see it peaked around 2004, and it declined. You had a plurality opposing it, constitutional reform by 2008, less than a year after Abe left office. But the important thing is that it was when Abe was prime minister that we had the sharpest angle of decline in support for constitutional reform. So precisely when he was promoting the idea, the public was backing away from it, which suggests that it backfired. On the other hand, public support for territorial defense is strong and growing. The public strongly supports missile defense. This is, one example. I have some other examples about strong support for defending the Senkaku Islands using the Coast Guard or even using the SDF. I won't spend too much time on that. Can we take this evidence and say the public is insensitive to external threats? I'd argue this would be an unwarranted conclusion, that rather the Japanese public focuses not only on the possibility of threats, but also the probability. How probable are threats? The North Korean threat was potentially very severe, disastrous if a war was to begin, yet the probability was very low because Japan had overwhelming military superiority over North Korea and could also rely on the deterrence of its U.S. ally. Japan also did invest in additional missile defense to parry the one threat North Korea could credibly pose to Japan, namely missile attacks, and of course again relied on the United States. Beyond these measures, Abe's attempts to expand overseas deployments of the SDF were simply rejected. So compared with these low probability and diffuse external threats, Japanese voters, on the other hand, focused on the collapse of the pension system as a more pressing threat to them personally, but arguably also to the nation overall and the national welfare. And also they saw that this was a threat for which there were available means that Japan and the government could exercise. So they saw a problem and a way potentially to solve it. Now finally, my final slide, has Abe learned from his first stint as prime minister? And it says here, apparently yes. And this is kind of a teaser for the discussion later. But in his second stint in power, I would argue Abe has learned lessons from his earlier tenure that are similar to what I've talked about here. He's been focusing on promoting domestic economic recovery, reform, promoting or implementing tax reform that actually helps to strengthen the pension system. He's concentrated on territorial defense and avoided proposing new overseas deployments. He could have sent the SDF back to Afghanistan. Let's keep in mind that non-event has not happened, and I think that suggests he's learned a lesson. There was a proposal in 2010 to send the MSDF back to the Indian Ocean to refuel ships involved in combat operations in Afghanistan. That also hasn't happened. Again, instead we've had this concentration on territorial defense. The collective self-defense debate that Wilhelm mentioned I would argue, has so far mostly been whittled down to a lot of mostly territorial defense-related scenarios, or in some sense it seems to have been rather theological rather than moving in a direction that would actually imply the use of force overseas, and particularly in places far removed from Japan. So with that, thank you for listening. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you for showing up. I'm going to speak a little bit on immigration, and as I have also only 10 minutes in very short time, I would like to start with the two main points maybe I would like to make. Generally, of course, Japan is seen as a non-immigration country. In fact, if we look back, still research up to 2000 about Japan, often Japan, if it was taken up in immigration research, it was taken up as a negative case, as a non-immigration country. Why does not immigration happen in Japan? But what I want to show today, actually, this is not true in 2 points. First, we have huge discourses, political and public debates on immigration in Japan. So immigration is an important topic. It's also a topic regarding securing the future for Japan from a point of view pro more immigration, but also from a point of view anti-immigration, not to let more people in. And the second point I also want to make is that those discourses are, I would say, rather being political arguments. And in fact, Japan is today, and is since the late 1980s, an immigration country. It's not recognized fully in the country, but Japan is already an immigration country. And this is the second point I want to speak a little bit on realities of immigration in Japan. But let me start with the debates, with the discourses. This is just one indicator for the public debate. A number of newspaper articles in 3 main newspapers on immigration topic. You can see early 1980s until late 1980s, very low number of articles. Most of the articles about immigration in other countries, not in Japan. But then irregular immigration starts in the late 1980s. We have also a labor force shortage during the bubble economy, and we have a huge public debate on immigration going on, and specifically on the question, how should Japan react to this new irregular immigration that is de facto happening? This then basically goes down with the burst of the bubble, the economic decline. It starts to pick up again in the late 1990s, and specifically can you also see about 2004-05, then really we have a second public debate. Important in this second debate, this is not so much because of labor force shortage or because irregular immigration is increasing again. No, the question here is really, how should Japan kind of use its immigration policy in the future? So how can Japan use strategically in the future immigration and immigration policy? The same thing we see also in the more in the policy circles. Here you see the numbers of proposals, substantial proposals on immigration made by interest groups, political parties, some commissions of different ministries. So these are really thick reports of 30 or more pages. And again, you can see late 1980s, you have a slow start. Then you have the first debate. It basically no proposals during 94 to 98. It increases again from 99, parallel to this public debate on demographic change, on the future, how should we use immigration in Japan. And specifically again, between 2004 and 2008, we have a huge debate. We have basically every second month one proposal coming out how Japan should use this immigration of foreign workers in the future and how immigration policy should be reformed. However, this whole debate doesn't lead to big reforms, we need to say. It dies down again in 2008 with the economic crisis who settles in and disappears. What you can see here, maybe in the end, we're right now at the point where I think the third debate starts. So in the context of Abenomics, again, the debate starts also with the Tokyo Olympics, with foreseeable labor shortage, especially also in the construction industry. We have right now a third debate on immigration. So what is the background that we have this second debate? As I said before, it's the demographic change. And just wrote this slide here, you see the number of people over 65 from 1950 to 2030. Important point, you can see up to the late 1980s, Japan is in international comparison a very young society. But then, in 20 years, it becomes the oldest society in the world. And this is, of course, because Japan went through the first demographic transition between 1920 and 1950. So there it had a large share of, still a large number of children, which all came into adulthood. And this means there we have a huge generation which from the 1980s onwards started to retire, to become older than 65. And this led to this huge demographic change, and also, of course, to a huge change in the people pyramid in Japan. You can see 1950, there we have still a typical pyramid. That's why it's called people pyramid. You can, however, see in 2007, it looks more like a Christmas tree, kind of. And of course, the projection for 2050 is that it will be even kind of an inverse pyramid. So what is, of course, foreseeable for the future is question of labor shortage, but also question, of course, how to finance some social security system. Just here one projection, and you can see here contributions and expenditures, and these projections as, for example, in 2050 there will be a deficit of 90.4 trillion yen, so huge deficit. And of course there's the point where some people said we need immigration. We need immigration in view of this change. And actually you could even argue that this whole debate shows actually that Japan is kind of a forerunner. One very known migration specialist, Holyfield, he made the suggestion that in the future advanced economies will no longer be economies of trade, but economies of immigration. The main question will not be how good you are in trade, but how good you are to attract immigrants. This was his projection. And you could say, to a certain degree, we can see this debate already in Japan. The interesting point is also when we then look at Japan public opinion on immigration, we have actually quite an open public opinion in the context of demographic change and long-term labor market development. For example, if you see here, this is an international social survey, and you can see Japan is actually among the classical immigration countries having rather an open opinion. Of course, you can see actually no country is really in favor in the public opinion of increasing immigration, but Japan is actually far away from Germany or Italy or other countries which have much more negative opinion in the context of accepting or reducing. So what we had at the time in 2004 to 2008 is a large number of proposals. Some said we would need an immigration state. Some even said Japan should turn into an immigration nation. So take in 10 millions up to 2050 of new immigrants. Now, the huge counter-argument against the immigration, Wilhelm already brought that up, with criminality, public security, foreign criminality. And there's a huge discourse, these are just some examples, on foreigners as threat to public security, as foreigners who lead to more criminality. We should also know that between 2004 and 2005, we had actually kind of a crime panic in Japan. So official statistics strongly increased crime, and one part of this public debate on crime at the time was specific to say that it's foreign population who is one of the main reasons for more crime. We see that also again in public opinion. You see in 2003, immigrants increase crime rates. Do you agree or not with this statement? And as you can see, Japan is really at the top. Which also means public opinion in Japan on immigration. I think the important is in which context you ask this question. If you bring us a questionnaire and you ask about demographic change and labor market in the long term, and then in the end you ask about immigration, you will find a majority of the people say, yes, we need immigrants. But if you do a survey where you ask about public security, crime, etc., you will find a very large majority of the population in Japan saying, no, no way, we don't need immigration. Immigration is bad for public security. Now, important point, the second I want to do is that to say that actually this is somehow a fertile debate because the fact that Japan is already an immigration country. And I just want to do this with this one slide here. You see this is a very basic indicator registered foreign residents in Japan. And as you can see, the interesting point is, you see up to 1985, these are the so-called oldcomers, so Korean immigrants from the colonial period and the descendants. Actually, their number is declining during the 1990s, but then you see the number of foreign residents is starting to increase more strongly, and these are the newcomers, the new immigrants, specifically from China, but also from Southeast Asia and from South America coming to Japan. And what you can also see, and I think this is an important point, this immigration is nearly linear. So it's not depending on the economic development. If you think between 1985 and 2005, there's huge change in the economic development in Japan. but the increase of immigrants is nearly linear. And this shows that actually today we have already in Japan not only continuous immigration, but also dependency in certain sectors on the labor market on foreign workers. And not only in those sectors of the labor markets which are normally shunned by the local native workers, but actually even in the export industries. And this is also one important factor why in 2010 we have a certain decrease, because specifically those immigrants coming from South America, Nikkei-jin, so Japanese immigrants and their descendants up to the third generation, they worked really in the export industry, so car industry, consumer electronics, and they, as you can see here, the number decreases from 2008 because, of course, this was exactly the export industry. We were strongly hit by the export. A second point I just want to do and hand over to Reinhard then is, as you can see, the main new group of the new immigrants are Chinese immigrants. And this, of course, is also something I didn't mention, but which Wilhelm already did. It's part of this debate on immigration and security, and in this sense, not public security, but national security, this strong increase of Chinese immigrants in Japan. And our hand over.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I would like to use this opportunity to thank my co-editor, Wilhelm Fosse. He kept the traction of this publication on. Otherwise, it would have, I think, not come to a moment of a launch today. And of course, also the Diver Foundation for giving us this opportunity. I'm dealing here with the Japanese reaction to Chinese investment in Japan. Basically, public perception, or how to sell some media, then reality, and finally the reaction by decision makers, opinion leaders about this. Yes, it's a bit strange. Here, two reactions, for example, and what is interesting is already in 2004, the Economisto writing that Chinese companies buy Japan. When you read further in this journal, it's not supported at all, but it's good to sell. The same here with Sapio, a right-wing magazine, which of course is the same thing that China is buying up all Japan. Totally over the top, but maybe good for sales figures. Now, why is this politically so sensitive in Japan? Why is it perceived as a risk? Well, first of all, general aversion against foreign players, against particularly mergers and acquisitions by foreign companies. Then, of course, specifically towards China, Japan's worries about its general economic decline, while China is, of course, gradually overtaking Japan in many fields. The novelty also of Chinese foreign direct investment, merger and acquisition. I mean, this is really turning off the tables. Then the acquisition of some iconic brand names, the greater visibility of Chinese people, as was just mentioned. I mean, there are now over 500,000 Chinese in Japan. And of course, apart from these residents, students, tourists, business people, numerous scandals surrounding the safety of imported Chinese food and cosmetic products, intellectual property rights violations, technology leaks, the hollowing out of the Japan's manufacturing sector, which is of course very much driven also by Japanese foreign direct investment, particularly in China. The fear of asset stripping, that a foreign company and a Chinese company buys a Japanese company and then sells all these parts and just keeps one part. High share of state-owned enterprises in the case of Chinese FDI. As a result of Chinese government policy, and particularly also targeting of ailing companies. Now, iconic brand names, very briefly. You may never have heard about it, but if you have visited Akihabara to buy some electronic goods, you may know about Laos there, which has been bought by a Chinese company, Suning, which is a very big company. I've never heard about it until I did this research. Then, for example, the apparel company Renown, and Honma Golf, those who play golf may have heard about it. I never had, but it is an iconic brand name. Now, some details here about what I just said. Land acquired through foreign capital. If you look at the foreign purchaser, you don't really suspect Chinese necessarily, but a lot of money from China is channeled through Hong Kong, Singapore, or the British Virgin Islands, quite clearly. It's particularly Hokkaido, which is attractive to the Chinese because of Chinese tourists going to Hokkaido, thanks also to a film made in Hokkaido, and so on. Chinese are interested also in buying forests because of the water resources. So that is something which attracts Japanese attention, media attention. Now, I would say it's exaggerated, these fears. First of all, these Chinese FDI M&A are minuscule in relation to Japan's total FDI to PRC, minuscule also in relation to the Chinese FDI M&A elsewhere, particularly Germany. Germany is a much more attractive destination for Chinese FDI and M&A. And for example, in 2001, China was the #1 investor with 158 projects, or almost 20% of the total. I mean, we are talking here about a very different ballgame. Here some statistics. Sorry, I don't recognize these here. These are the Chinese statistics. Now, what is interesting, I have a table with Chinese and the next one Japanese statistics. The Chinese statistics, of course, are lower because they only take into account those funds which flow out of the People's Republic of China, whereas in the case of they take into account all the money, whereas the Japanese statistics only take into account the money which comes directly from the People's Republic of China. That's why a difference in these statistics. Here, particularly politically relevant and very attractive to the media and the attention in general in Japan are Chinese M&A into Japan. You have here the total number from 2010 to 2012, the total from Asia, and of which the Chinese occupy a considerable number. But you see also that it has gone down. And here I can offer you, thanks to our launch party today, the most up-to-date figures. The figures have gone down in 2013 to 70 altogether from Asia. No, this has gone up, of course, but from China down to 22 in 2013. Sorry, this has to be read noticed because of the display distortion. But I just wonder how long that this trend will continue going down. In 2010, China for the first time overtook US cases. Quite interesting, but in 2011, the US again top. Well, the reactions, that was the reality of the figures, which are very modest. The reaction by decision makers, opinion leaders is, of course, much more forward-looking and welcoming Chinese investment. Why? Because of the Japanese economy, China being #1 trading partner, Japanese government actively promoting Chinese investment in Japan, and so on. So you see here a list of various things which are done to enhance, to attract Chinese investment in Japan. This is particularly interesting for local governments which want to revive their economy. And unfortunately, I have to stop with this in order to keep it in the time. Thank you very much indeed.